Is it live? Are we out there? Hello, everybody. Okay. Hi, I'm Alex Buzansky, President of Impact Justice, and welcome to today's virtual conversation, Women, Justice, and the Movement, with Gina Clayton-Johnson, Executive Director of Essie Justice Group, and Aishatu Yusuf, Director of Innovation Programs at Impact Justice. For those who don't know, Impact Justice is a national innovation and research center based in Oakland, California, and Washington, D.C. We work across the country to create a more humane and restorative system of justice. We're hosting these conversations on a wide range of critical issues on the front lines of justice reform with experts who can help to address the challenges, ideas, and opportunities to help reach our common goal. Before we continue, I wanted to just extend a special thank you to so many of you who are joining us today on the West Coast and from the Gulf Coast, and places where we're all trying to figure out how to navigate multiple environmental crises that seem to be converging on top of everything else going on in our lives right now. So thank you all for joining us. For today's conversation, we're delving into an often overlooked issue, the distinct needs of women affected by the justice system, whether they're impacted directly by having experienced incarceration or their experiences have been more invisible as supporters of loved ones who've been locked up. This conversation will shed light on some of the impacts they face and the distinct needs of women. Honestly, we couldn't ask for a better pair to discuss this essential topic. And their bios, their full bios are in the event invite. I did just want to say a few words. Aishatu Yusuf is the Director of Innovation Programs at Impact Justice. She has spent the majority of her career working within multiple social systems with the purpose of creating better outcomes for marginalized youth, young people, and their families. Among just a few of the things she has done, Aishatu has worked to reduce the education, health, and employment barriers for formerly incarcerated women, evaluated the strengths and needs of girls in gangs, and conducted research and drafted policy recommendations that address interrupting school to confinement pathways for girls of color. Gina Clayton-Johnson is the Executive Director of Essie Justice Group, which she founded. It was named after her great-grandmother, Essie Bailey, in 2014 to harness the collective power of women with incarcerated loved ones to end mass incarceration's harm to women and communities. Gina has spent more than a decade advocating for communities of color. While she has had an incredible career and done some amazing things, and you should go read about them if you haven't already, I wanted to note that as an attorney in Harlem, New York, Gina represented women of color who were facing eviction as a result of a family member's criminal matter. She designed and implemented the housing defense practice at the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem after seeing how women with loved ones behind bars were suffering, resulting in weakened communities. Gina began to look for organizations and academic literature that addressed criminal justice with a focus on women with incarcerated loved ones, and she found none. So she did what many forces of nature do. She founded Essie Justice Group for those women, and we're grateful that she did. I just want to say these are two amazing people who both possess incredible energy, commitment, and a tireless commitment to change. Honestly, the opportunity to eavesdrop on a conversation between the two of them was something I couldn't resist, and we wanted to share that opportunity with all of you for you to be able to listen in on. You're welcome to post your questions throughout our discussion. This is Zoom. I think we all know how to use it now at the bottom using the chat function, and we'll try to get to them at the end. Thank you again for joining us. And now I have the pleasure of turning this over to Aishatu Yusuf. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alex. And Gina, clearly always a wonderful moment to be in conversation with you. And I consider myself lucky that I get to be in community with you in the work that we do. So anytime we get to chat is a joy for me. I want to give folks a quick rundown really fast. Gina and I are both located in evacuation zones on the West Coast. So if there's moments that we have to grab water or cough, please know that it's because the air is hazardous. So please forgive us for that before we even get started. Gina, before I actually get to having a conversation with you, I want to kind of ground the conversation in some kind of real life facts about what's happening with women in the United States carceral system. So, you know, the incarcerated female population has nearly increased 8 times since 1980. Since 1980 to 2018, incarcerated women has increased by 750%. That percentage alone is hard to say out loud. And of those numbers, Black women are incarcerated twice the rate of white women, and Latinx or Latina women are incarcerated 1.3 times the rate of white women. This drastic increase of incarceration, researchers, much like folks at your organization, have linked this to a lot of things. The linkages have been to the expansion of drug sentencing laws, to the lack of diversion programs for women, to the increase of criminalization of girls in school, particularly Black girls in school, the increase of law enforcement at schools leading to that criminalization, the increase of criminalization of women who practice sex work, and the lack of robust reentry services tailored specifically for women and girls. It's also really important to note, and I know you know this, it's important to note that the majority of women and girls that are incarcerated are there for nonviolent crimes. However, I think when we're talking about the carceral impacts or the impacts of a carceral system on women, we often are leaving out a huge piece of the conversation that I think Essie gets to the heart of. We often are leaving out the conversation of what's happening to women that are both incarcerated and not incarcerated. For the folks that are listening, so Gina, I met you in one of the earlier stages of the Essie Justice Group. I was actually on the advisory committee really early on, which seems like ages ago. So much life has happened since that moment. But when I came in contact with Essie and you, for me, it was one of the first times that I had heard an organization or really anybody talk specifically about the needs of women that have incarcerated loved ones, or the needs of women that have someone incarcerated that they love. And for me, it felt like Essie was starting this obvious yet invisible conversation. And for me, it was almost a mind-blowing moment, because it felt like, why haven't we been talking about this? Because people that walk in my skin and walk in your skin know this to be true. In 2018, you released, well, you as an Essie Justice Group released a report titled "Because She's Powerful: The Political Isolation of Resistance of Women with Incarcerated Loved Ones." I know you'll go deeper into this report later in this conversation, but I want to kind of talk about that. This report really exposed the inequities and the experiences of the people you work with and the people you've talked to. I think one of the stats you quote in there is 1 in 4 women across all races and 1 in 8 Black women have somebody that they love that's incarcerated. You know, Essie, I think this report, and I think Essie has really created a robust conversation around the ricocheting effect of what it means to have talk about incarceration for both folks on the inside and the outside. So before I actually get to you coming into this conversation, I actually want to quote something directly from the report that Essie released. And the reason I'm going to use exact language is because I think it's very pertinent to the conversation when we talk about incarcerated women and their loved ones. So I'm going to use actual direct language from that. So beginning quote, so everyone knows it's not me. Beginning quote is, women with incarcerated loved ones include currently incarcerated women. Women with incarcerated loved ones love and support all genders behind bars. Women with incarcerated loved ones are cisgender, transgender, and gender nonconforming. Given the prevalence and influence of racialized and gendered stereotypes in our society, it is easy to embrace the tropes depicting women's experiences as mere accidental collateral consequences of the mass incarceration of men, or assuming that this community is homogeneously comprised of women on the outside supporting men who they love on the inside. So end quote right there. I find that extremely important to talk about, and when I read that in your report, my heart exploded, because we know that in this work, so often the experiences of women are decentered, or they're talked about in relation to men. And, you know, Essie Justice Group, the Ms. Foundation, Alliance for Girls, the National Black Women's Justice Institute, Girls for Gender Equity, and us also at Impact Justice, we have an onus on us to center the experiences of women and girls in this work not as marginal. And your report, but also the work of Essie, does that seamlessly. And that doesn't mean it's not hard, but seamlessly does that. So I think that takes me into kind of the first bit of the conversation I would love to have with you right now, which is probably something you answer a lot, which is, can you dive a bit deeper into some of the unique and maybe invisible ways that women are impacted by mass incarceration? Specifically, if you can get into what has Essie learned and what is Essie doing with that knowledge?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Aishatu. Thank you, Alex. What a pleasure it is to have this conversation with you, Aishatu. I know that, you know, you have been really linked. We've been linking arms in this work since the beginning. I will forever remember that conversation we had out in front of the Oakland
Oh my goodness,
Hall.
yes.
And we were talking about all of this. So I hope this is part 2 of that conversation.
Yes.
When, but you have really been a thought partner in the development of Essie in so many important ways. And so this is just such a pleasure. And I really look forward to having this conversation. And the work of impact justice has just been really a North Star for me personally as an organizational leader. Particularly Alex's leadership is one that I look up to tremendously. And so this is a conversation with family, and I'm just so happy and thankful for all of you who made time to join us in this talk today. So, as was stated, I founded Essie Justice Group in 2014. And we are a loving and powerful community of women with incarcerated loved ones. We're based in California, but indeed have been moving through spaces in national ways, as well as we set forth to kind of build this sisterhood of social justice to end incarceration's harm to women in the communities that we come from. I want to share kind of what brought me in this work, and as a way to kind of share a little bit about what the impacts have been that I have seen and that we're addressing. So I started my work really as a youth organizer here in Los Angeles, which is where I'm calling from, and was very motivated to pursue just about any kind of find any kind of answer, tool, solution that I could to help empower and to bring back solutions to communities that I come from and care about, particularly Black communities in Los Angeles. And so that led me to law school. Now, in my first year of law school, I was far away from home, and someone I love was sentenced to 20 years in prison. I remember getting that phone call, and I remember that the isolating irony of going to these intimidating criminal law classes where I was studying hypothetical cases and cases that had long since been, been fought and had ended, and going home to write a letter to a sentencing judge to, pleading for leniency in a very real case that was impacting my life and life of my loved ones, and remembering just like how a couple things about that. One, how isolating that was, how I felt like there was nobody that I could really, or that I knew that I could talk to in that environment. And second, how limiting this place that I thought, I was at Harvard, so I thought this is the place that if there's, going to be power and solutions and access, it's going to be here. And yet I was shown, I think, in that moment, the limitations of what kind of halls of power offer in moments where we need to find avenues towards change. And so, but what it did do is it woke me up in some pretty big ways around what incarceration was doing to our families and to our people. So I went from there. I dedicated, I think, at that moment, really, my life to changing the system, this criminal legal system. And I ended up in a law office in Harlem called the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. And I built this housing practice that Alex talked a little bit about. And one of the very first cases that I took was a case involving a woman, her name was Sandria, who had a grandson who was arrested blocks away from her apartment. Now, he didn't live with her. It was an arrest that he, but by the time she came to talk to me, had not been adjudicated, had not been tried, he had not been convicted of anything. And yet she came to talk to me because she was, as a result of this arrest, fighting for her home in an eviction case in which, the housing authority where she lived, because he had, to his arresting officer, given her address when they, he was 17 years old, dead of night, he thinks an address, he thinks of his grandmother's house. Like, how many of us think about our grandmothers or our matriarchs in our lives when we're thinking about the source of safety and stability in a moment of fear, right? How many of us is that? So that was him. He gave that address, and based on nothing more than that one statement to that police officer, she ends up going back and forth. I mean, a disabled elderly woman going back and forth to court to administrative proceedings, to fight for her home of 20 years, right? And what I remember about that was not just that we fought and threw a tremendous amount of resources at that case. I mean, like 13 exhibits, I cross-examined a police officer. I had to you would have thought this was like the trial of the century. You know, this is a housing case with a, elderly woman who had a clean tenant record, who New York City was trying with all of their might to displace.
Yeah.
Unfathomable, I think, for most people who are not deep inside of this work. But what really broke my heart in that case, and in all of the cases that I would go on to represent, because I would get it over and over again, was hearing the question, Gina, how long do I have before I have to move out? How long can you get me before I have to move out? Now, I became a lawyer, and I went into this work because I had a bone to pick. I wanted to Aishatu, I wanted to stick my finger up in some DA's face and be like, justice now, give me back our people, I wanted to do all of that, right? And so to be inside of these conversations with Black and brown women who were in survival mode, who were not in fight mode, who were asking questions like, how long can you get me? In cases like that, where I'm like, what? You should not have to move out? What? You shouldn't even be in this situation. Someone should be paying you for what has happened to you just in trying to get you out of this apartment. It is an injustice. My question was, how do we transition that, right? That mentality, because, and what I realized was, and this is to answer your question, what is happening to women as a result of our addiction, of this country's addiction to incarceration, to criminalization, to punishment? It is that this level of isolation that is so severe, that is so psychologically, emotionally debilitating, that it renders us without our power, without our ancestral power, tools, solutions, and energies to go up against these systems of harm and oppression. And who do we need fighting the most? It is these women, right? And because when we speak, we are powerful. We are a moral authority. And we have the solutions, right? And that is, I think, what I realized is not just the harm. I actually came out of that experience not just excited about, or not just motivated around the harm, right? I saw all kinds of harms. It's horrible what's happening to particularly Black and brown women and girls of color. But what I think motivates me is the promise and the potential of what happens when this group is organized. And so that is why Essie Justice Group, and that is why, we talk about political isolation, which I can go into more as you asked about later. But that's what really leads me and motivates me around this work, is that, we need to resist in building, resist isolation, resist kind of the oppressive kind of conditions that we are seeing all over the country in this moment, through community building, through organizing, to propel change that's led by people who are directly impacted.
Thank you so much, Gina, and thank you for the truth, right? Which I think so often in these conversations, we are often kind of left to our PC answers. So I appreciate you providing your truth. And I think I resonated particularly with that. So I too, my entire life, I have had an incarcerated loved one. And I grew up particularly in an area that was predominantly not Black and brown. And so my family and we consistently felt isolated, not only because we felt like we were the only one that had a sibling a person that we loved that was incarcerated, but because we were also surrounded by people who didn't look like us. And I remember, I have chills because I remember, because it still feels that way for me. Not only was it isolating, but it became unhealthy. Right? Because isolation, which I want to ask you to get to in a little bit, is tied to our health. Right? There's so much conversation that we talk about on what it means to be a healthy person, generally speaking, and how these different iterations of life impact not just the health of folks that we love, but ourselves. And so I'm actually going to get into that right now because, you know, I think in the report you say, and I'm going to say, you say that folks that have incarcerated loved ones disproportionately experience high levels of stress, anxiety, depression, migraines, insomnia, fatigue, and I think isolation is both in a comma in that, but also the cause and then an outcome of that. I think isolation kind of weaves itself through all of that. And then at Impact Justice, the research and action team that we have right now is actually doing a project right now with NBWJI and Cal Wellness, looking at the intersections of health and the justice system. So for me, criminal justice reform or criminal legal reform is health reform, because we can't have either of those conversations without them being linked. I think particularly when we're dealing with Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities that have long suffered inadequate health and negligent health outcomes because of a system that operates as it has been designed to, but impacts Black and Brown women in astronomical ways. So if you could get just a little bit deeper into that, what the impacts of isolation are, both to women on the inside and the outside, but also how do we push the conversation that the linkages of health and the justice system past where it is right now? Who do we talk to? What are we supposed to say?
Yeah, this is very important, because at the very beginning, so before Essie, really no one was talking about women with incarcerated loved ones. In fact, that's a phrase that just wasn't a thing, right? Despite the fact that, you know, 1 in 4 women, as you had said, have incarcerated loved ones or have a loved one inside prison, which, you know, we're not even talking about jails and detention centers with that stat. But for Black women, it's 1 in 2. And that's important. And I think we have really overlooked to a great extent the health impacts of this. And one of the early conversations that I had with my team, and I think maybe even with you, was like how difficult it is to talk about what's happening to the people who are perceived as collateral to this system. And particularly in a gendered context in which sympathy for, or empathy for the pain of Black women, brown women is just not readily given or available, right? And so the number of times that I knew that unless I came with some data, that I would get an eye roll or like, oh well, you know, women are just lonely or whatever, that I knew that we needed some data, because that was the environment in which we were working in. And so we needed data and we needed a validator. So I'll tell you, I found the validator, which is unfortunate reality that we need these things, but we do. So I was listening to under Obama, the Surgeon General speaking, and he was talking about how he dedicated his entire tenure to the crisis of loneliness and isolation that he observed. His assessment was that we have a crisis of loneliness and isolation in this country, and that it has health impacts, that is having health impacts that are just as great as heart disease and some forms of cancer, that it was actually reducing the lifespans of Americans. That was his assessment and independent conclusion. You better believe, Aishatu, I went up to him and I stood in a long ass line to go and make sure I could talk to him. And we got a follow-up call. And I asked him, I said, we talked for a while and it was very interesting. And I remember asking him, like, do you have any analysis around why? Like, why is this happening? Why are we all so lonely and isolated? Well, now we have another layer of COVID, right, to add to that. But he was like, well, no, Gina, actually, I'm very interested in the what is happening and the how to solve it, but I haven't really gone into the why. And I was like, well, let me tell you, 4 decades of policy that are designed, mass incarceration policy, right, that are designed to build prisons, to separate individuals from their communities through distance, through bars, through concrete, through stigma, through marginalization, like that. We have actually literally invested in isolation. Right. And so what is that done? What has that done to women? So Essie Justice Group, we did a study of over 1,000 women with incarcerated loved ones all, shared their stories, filled out long surveys. We partnered with 14 organizations across the country. All 50 states plus Puerto Rico, participated. And what we found was that 86% of women characterized the impact of a loved one's incarceration on their own emotional and mental health as significant or extreme. Now, combine that with the results of our most recent study, we just released it a week and a half ago, and people can find it at livesontheline.org, where we look at what is the impact today of having a loved one behind bars on women during COVID, and 76% reported an increase in stress and anxiety, already above, right, that baseline of the extreme and significant mental health strain and emotional strain. And so the mental health and the depression and the levels of suicidality and combined with, and I think this is important, is combined with the very important function that Black and brown women with incarcerated loved ones have in their communities is very alarming and should be of concern to literally everybody who is invested in community and social welfare and wellness. And that is because it is also women who are the navigators of these complex systems, who are getting the kids, educated, fed, ready, who are the emotional kind of tethers between, loved ones inside and family members on the outside, who are the income earners and the breadwinners. We are seeing that this is attacking not just, a quote vulnerable population, I think, as many would say, but a vital one and integral one in the stability and the sustainability of Black and brown communities. In terms of the physical health, I lot of people, I think we're still fighting in kind of the mental health and healthcare spaces that for mental and emotional wellness to be considered as important as like a physical ailment, right? So for all those who don't yet get that mental health is health, the majority of women, 63% of women actually also reported that their physical health had been significantly or extremely affected by a loved one's incarceration. And so we are seeing huge health impacts. And yet and this is, I'm not going to call anyone out here, but I do want to say that I have been disappointed with the slowness of women's rights advocacy to consider incarceration and criminal legal system reform as a centerpiece of a women's rights agenda. And I think many organizations are doing that, right? And yet I think we need more. And these statistics and all of the anecdotes and all of the experiences of our membership, I think really show that incarceration and mass incarceration have been huge barriers to gender justice in this country, and need to be thought of in that way, as along with all of the other things that we understand mass incarceration to be doing or to be coming from.
Thank you. So for the context of the audience, I remember sitting in a cabin in the mountains with the Essie Justice Group prior to the conversation about that report, the conversation about the need to create data regarding folks that have loved ones in prison. Like, that conversation is so vivid to me because, again, I think it was another opportunity that I felt seen, right? We have, it's not robust, but there is at least an organization that exists about children with incarcerated parents, right? There again, not huge, but it's done amazing work, right? We need to talk about that in amazing ways and in more robust ways and more clear ways in policy. But there wasn't anyone talking about how everyone else in that family is impacted by incarceration. And so I remember those conversations about, we got to find data, we need to get the stories about that. And my identity as a researcher and evaluator was like, yep, that's exactly what needs to happen, because those are the folks that's how we're going to move the message, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and you know what's so important about this too, because people would tell me, well, Gina, what about families, right? Families are important. And yes, families are important, absolutely. And we have organizations and we have work that's been done around like, what are the impact on family members and that sort of thing. And yet we weren't saying women. And I think this is really important, because what does it mean? What's the significance of that? Is that just, semantics? No, it's political. Like, you say women, and you can start to talk about patriarchy.
Yeah.
you say women, you can start to talk about gender injustice. And the fact of the matter is that what's happening inside of our systems and our society right now around the criminal legal system is absolutely tied up with our our predilections towards violence, our ideologies that say solve every problem with a violent punitive solution. Those are patriarchal teachings, essentially, right? Like the prison system in general, I call prisons like schools of patriarchy, right? Like it's incredibly important to understand that we are in the midst of multiple types of harmful ideologies that come down incredibly hard on particular people who sit at the intersections of those identities, right? So that's what we mean when we say intersectionality. That's what we talk about when we say intersectionality in terms of the identities. And our approaches need to be intersectional. So we've heard, we need intersectional approaches. We need to be able to talk about gender injustice and all of that. But if you're not talking about women, and if you don't ask women what's going on in their lives, then this is something that we cannot do, right? So that's Essie is all about talking about families, and yet we insist that when you mean women, say women. Right? Don't say families. When you mean women, what's happening to women, say women, because that's really important for us to get to the right solutions.
I think what you said is also particularly important when we talk about the health impacts of this, because in the work that I've done, and I don't know, I know you've seen this as well, but the work that we continue to see is that people don't link mental health to the issues of health for women, because Black and brown women don't deserve to be vulnerable, right? Black and brown women don't deserve to have mental health needs, right? Like every single TV show we see about Black women is like the idea of a strong Black woman, right? And that's the idea that we love to trope around. And so when we're thinking about the disproportionalities in our prisons and jail, we're thinking about, again, Black and brown people, right? With usually Black and brown women on the outside or the inside, but on the outside. And so when we think about what's happening and who we're talking about another piece of the population that, again, hasn't gotten inquiry in the United States, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but Dr. Morris talks a lot about the value placed on inquiry. And as a society, that's how we distinguish value. So girls, women, particularly Black, brown, and Indigenous girls and women, haven't even deserved the inquiry to know the data to understand what's happening, right? Which is something that Essie did, right? You said, I need to know the data because we live in this world, and I'm going to prove that I know that this is a problem. But it goes back to that same idea of like, who deserves inquiry, who has value, and then how does it, we have to state what those things are so we can see change. And I think one of the things I want to get to too, because these are also linked to me, is when we talk about health, we're also talking about your mental health, your physical, but also your financial health, right? Because one of the things that I think is really clear is that usually women that are incarcerated, right, they're usually incarcerated outside of their community. So seeing them, getting to them is expensive and less possible. For one, women are usually incarcerated pre-trial, pre-sentencing. So they're sitting in jail without that, and they can't afford bail. They usually can't afford bail because they are typically the primary caregivers of their families, and they typically make so much money less than men do. So, right? And I think in your report, correct me if I'm wrong, you say that bail typically is about $10,000 to $500 to $50,000, $10,000 to $50,000. I believe it was your report. If not, it was the Prison Policy Institute, but you can tell me at the end. But either way, that's a lot of money, and it's a lot of money that women cannot afford, and they're sitting in jail cells. Without even a sentence because they can't afford to get out. So Essie created the hashtag End Money Bail, but even past End Money Bail, the Bailing Out Black Mamas campaign. And you did that for a reason. And I would love for you to go into more detail about how the bail system exploits women, and then also why you created this campaign and what have been some of the outcomes of this.
Absolutely. So yeah, so glad you asked about bail. There's a lot to be said about that, particularly in California. But what I will say is, in response to your, how do we begin to kind of bail out Black women and Black mamas? this actually started, so a lot of the work that Essie does and movement organizations in general do is in coalition, right? Because we know that to address big things in big ways, we need to be working in unison and together. So there's not any one organization that can do it by themselves, but we need to be working in coalition. So we're part of a couple of coalitions. We're part of the National Bailout. We're founding members of the National Bailout Collective. And we're also, I sit on the policy table for the Movement for Black Lives. And so we're also very active inside of Movement for Black Lives national formation. In terms of the National Bailout, this was a meeting that we, myself, a number of organizers, Black organizers from across the country were at in Georgia, and Mary Hooks, comrade and friend, just I think was feeling into an ancestral dictate to when she said, you know what, why don't we just go get our people? Why don't we just go bail out some Black mamas? So it was from her lips, right, to into that room of strategists that came that idea. And we have, since that moment, for the next 3-4 years, we would bail out Black people every Mother's Day, Black mothers, every Mother's Day. And in California, that coincided with our campaign work, because we were doing pretrial and continue to be fighting for pretrial justice that looks like decarceration and liberty and freedom. And so I think what that means is that we're not just fighting for an end to money bail, we're fighting for people to be released, right? Because you could see a situation, and in some places this is the case, where money bail does not exist, but you still have people in pretrial detention, not able to fight their cases from the outside, which was what we know, how you actually are able to have any kind of fighting chance of being able to win your case is when you're fighting it from the outside. And so this year, I can just share, every year we bail people out, but in California it was very hard because we actually have some of the highest bail amounts of the country. Our bails are an average $50,000, and nationally that's 10 times the national average. And so this year we bailed out a mother from Los Angeles who had actually just about a year ago had suffered the loss of her child in a car accident, and had since that time been incarcerated. So she had been incarcerated for many, 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 many months. She was disabled, actually in a wheelchair, and COVID hits. And we found her and we're like, we got to get you out. But when we went and did the research, we found her bail was $200,000. $200,000. And that is the situation of many women, many mothers who are inside and away from their children. And the majority of women who are incarcerated inside our jail systems, right? This is like a very, when you talk about how can we focus on the way in which incarceration is impacting women, we need to have a conversation about what's happening inside of county jails. And so, we were able to we had to independently raise the money because we couldn't get all of that from the National Bailout Collective. And we were able to finally reach that amount. We bought her freedom. And on the day that she was released, she was met by other women within our membership, Black and brown women who have, way more experience than any of us have ever wanted to have in loving and caring for and bringing home and being the reentry support for someone who's been behind bars. But we're the perfect, loving, expert, kind of sisterhood force that she needed in that moment. And she's been doing very, very well since. There was a woman that we bailed out the year before that who was arrested because she was living in her car and a neighbor had called the police for her to, I guess, I don't know, because they were concerned. And she ended up being arrested and taken away from her child. And as a result, put in a jail cell. Like these are the kinds of things that we are seeing and that we are using inside of campaigns to be able to point out that what we don't need more of is police style solutions to issues of housing shortages, or to be trauma responders to people, particularly women, who have suffered losses of their family members, or trauma, or sex assault. I mean, what we see is that women are being incarcerated because of the inadequacies of of community support, right? That we just don't actually have that infrastructure because we are really misspending the resources that we do have in directions that are punitive. And so that's what the national bailout and the work of our work inside of that formation has really looked like. And it's been some of the most beautiful and gratifying work. I'll just tell you one more story of Jamisha. She's now a member of Essie Justice Group. And she is, I remember meeting her in Santa Rita jail where she was incarcerated, and it was her first arrest, and she's in on $50,000 bail. We bail her out. And she makes every single one of her court dates. She had like 8 court dates. She made every single one of them, was on time, was working actually as a home health care worker before she was arrested, was able to, regain employment during that time when she was fighting her case. And then the judge switched. There was a new judge all of a sudden in her case. And that new judge decided that he was going to redetermine kind of how the charges worked and what the bail formula was going to be, and jacked up the bail to $450,000, took her out of the arms of her community on that court date, and sent her back to jail. I mean, the trauma, I can't even, and at this point, all of the Essie sisters, our members are called sisters, all of the Essie sisters were stacking the court. We were in every pew, or row, I don't know, it's not church, but, we were in every single row. And it was horrifying, to see her just being stripped away. And up until the point when she was incarcerated, she had never been away from her son, who was, young, I think 3 years old at the time. And so, what we did was we fought again because we needed more, now we needed more money to buy her freedom. And this is the injustice of bail, right? The judge is saying that she can go, you can have her back, community, family, son, but only if you can give me $450,000. Right. So someone, working, in Silicon Valley, who has all the money, who can go ahead and do that. But Jamisha, no way she could not, right? And many of us cannot do that. And it's blatantly unfair. And so we were able to raise the money. It took us a little while, but we raised it. Wow. She was released and her case was dismissed. So all of the, and that I say that it's like I think, people will feel good hearing that story. Maybe, I don't know. But there's also this feeling where you're like, but what she just went through, that was trauma. The time that her son was away from her and she was away from her son, that's trauma. There are impacts of that, right? And I think that the way in which our studies, as you point out, our research and our examination of what is really going on, it doesn't capture all of this. It doesn't capture all of those nights filled with fear and confusion. I think that those are the things that we really need to understand as we pursue our change, and looking at what is happening inside the lives of Black and Brown women is a really good way to get insight into the whole and the fullest picture that we need to understand before we start recommending solutions.
Yeah, you said so much in that moment, in that statement. A couple of things I'm going to pull out particularly is, I think the stat is 60% of women behind bars have a child under the age of 18. I linked that to some research that was done by the NBWJI that said the biggest issues of reentry are employment and resources to navigate the child welfare system. Because when women are incarcerated. Again, they're incarcerated typically waiting for bail, pre-trial, pre-arrest. I mean, pre-trial, pre-sentencing, right? They're waiting to pay their bail. They don't have money to pay bail. Then this is a loss of job. This is the loss of your child, right? So it's trauma that went from the woman to the child to the entire community. So I think, like, for me, the bail fund that you're doing is bigger than just actually dollars. It's talking about how it is we get people back to their families and their communities, how we get women back to their families and their communities, because we're exacerbating trauma across this entire line.
Oh, yeah. And at Essie, it's not just, you know, for us, like, everything is about a systemic change. Like, we're organizers, right? So we're like pursuing big change. And so what we did was, in the midst of that, we went and approached Google and Facebook and fought, and were able to win the largest divestment, corporate divestment from the bail industry to date. And that was because of, you know, the courage of women like Jamisha telling her story, right? And saying, this is how this is impacting us. And so I think that, like, it's really important also when we're doing data that we're building power. If you're not building power, if you're not connecting directly impacted people in the midst of your pursuit for change, then you're not doing the work in the way that I think is most important and potent. And so for us, you know, that's critical. Like all of that data that I shared around the Because She's Powerful report, it was women with incarcerated loved ones going to the jail lines, going to, you know, inside prisons, meeting with each other, holding focus groups, asking each other questions. And you better believe that the relationships that formed and were forged inside of that project, you know, still exist and were able to be translated into our campaign teams that we now have up and down the state, right? And so, like, it's that type of work and that type of strategy that's really also needed in terms of the thoughtfulness about, like, how are we going to get out of this mess? Because these are huge and very well resourced, entrenched forces. The police, the, you know, systems of, you know, prison system, et cetera, are incredibly well resourced. And we know they got, you know, their unions and a whole bunch of other things. And so we need to be working together and very strategically if we're going to be able to take those forces on in the way that we need to win.
Yeah, I think one of the pieces that you said there was about the investment of it, which goes back into this idea of who's deserving of inquiry, who's also deserving of investment. And actually, we got a question from the audience about this, so this leads into, like, a really good statement, I think. So the Ms. Foundation released a report called Pocket Change: How Women and Girls of Color Do More with Less, urging philanthropic communities to give more better with greater transparency. Particularly the stat that they said, which was amazing to me, said that giving to women and girls of color accounts for 0.5% of $66.9 billion from foundations. So just to be clear, this totals $5.48 per woman and girl in the United States. So basically, my investment is worth $5.48 to the funding stream of the United States, right? And so I guess one of the things that I'm interested in your opinion on, or just bringing more to the forefront, is how do we get, or what is the conversation around investment in women and girls? I think today, actually, the Grantmakers for Girls of Color released the $1 billion for Black Girls Fund today, which is their goal of raising $1 billion but over 10 years to give to organizations and to folks that are working on behalf of Black women and girls. So for me, I guess the question continues, as you said, you went to Google, you went to Silicon Valley, you went to these folks that are not primarily in the justice system, and you fought for investment. So I guess for me, what do you believe will take to get folks to invest in women? And honestly, a bigger thing is, what's at stake if they do not?
Ooh, yeah, I don't know. This is a hard one for me. Because, you know, Teresa Younger sits on our board of directors. She is brilliant. And I know a close friend of Alex's. And, you know, I think, I'm sure all of us have had these conversations with her. She is, you know, really been a leader in exposing the injustice inside of our, you know, kind of philanthropic spaces that we're seeing, and how that plays out on the ground. You know, I experienced it as a Black woman founder ED, and saw and have seen the ways in which, you know, my male counterparts will walk away with a whole lot more in terms of, you know, they'll get the check and I'll get the speaking engagement request, you know, like it is, you know, we talk about it in terms of on the ground, you know, it looks like women being asked for stories, but not solutions, right? Like there's a lot of, there's a lot of just kind of patterned patriarchy that has informed how we do the work, what the funding looks like, that we're not, just because we're in the field doesn't mean that we are not free of. And so I think that reports like this are very promising because I think that they lead to and they agitate in a way that does lead to a lot of, like, you know, folks who may be well-intentioned and just didn't realize that they were giving in ways that were biased, right? Or were biased in a particular direction. The consequences of not getting this right, I mean, are manifold. I think that in general, if we are students, good students of social change, we understand that it is women who bring about large-scale progressive social change at every turn, right? It's not the kind of stories that we were, you know, the misinformed, I think, stories, or the overly simplified stories of, like, a man made a speech one day and then everyone listened and then we did a thing like a, you know, Civil Rights Act and then it all changed. Like, nah, you know, like what we know is that there was a tremendous strategy development, organizing and infrastructure that women were building throughout the civil rights movement that brought us to the place that, you know, that we, many of us, you know, are grateful for having come to, even if it's incomplete, in terms of civil rights victories, right? And so I think similarly, today we see, again, women leading in incredibly important ways, and that leadership needs to be resourced. And we also need to understand that, like, in the midst of that leadership, women are also holding down on particularly directly impacted leadership, are also holding down on all of the family fronts and the community fronts, right? And so I don't think we can have this conversation without lifting up the name of Andrea James, for example, right? Who, formerly incarcerated woman, brilliant visionary of you know, the council and their work, Susan Burton, you know, Dolores Canales. There's so many brilliant women who have been holding this work down, who've been fighting for people, and particularly women on the inside and girls. You know, you mentioned Monique Morris. There are so many, and I think have gone under or not at all funded for years of their work. And so it is important, and I'm not sure, you know, how much I can say to that, but I'm just so glad that you've raised and opened up the possibility for everyone to learn more about the Ms. Foundation report, because it's incredibly important.
Yeah, I think that, thank you. Yeah, I think that, you know, for us, it's no secret that, generally speaking, like, the investment and conversation on the needs of women and girls is lacking. And I think that to say that, though, without the caveat of the amazing work that women have been doing by supporting themselves,
right,
by investing, by collectively investing in themselves. Like, Kimberly Crenshaw was the one who started the hashtag Say Her Name, right? Because no one was talking about the murders of Black women in this country at the hands of systems, right? And so I think that you're absolutely right, as we need to move and have a conversation around how we widen investment while also giving credence to what's being done, just in spite or with that or in between that, whatever the, you know, a piece of that. Like, I wanna get to one question that we have right before we end time. From the audience is really around, you said something earlier around the way in which police are investing, or the police interventions that we're working to change. And I think that's tied to Essie's hashtag Defund the Police, or in defense of Black lives. Can you talk just really quickly, like literally 2 minutes, about what you mean by changing the way the police is investing in the communities a little bit, and what maybe defund police means to Essie?
When I think about defund, I think about contracting systems that have caused us harm as Black people, and investing in systems that keep us safe. So it looks like understanding the fact that the role that we have, that police are playing, has ballooned into and encroached upon so many specialties and functions that we ought to imagine other specialists and experts doing, you know, everything from youth services to responding to drug overdoses, to being to responding to noise complaints, to traffic violations, to, you know, a whole number of things that we actually don't need somebody with the lawful authority to, like, kill a person, and doing that we see defund as being really about, right, is the contract, is saying, look, punitive solutions actually haven't worked. Policing is not working. It has been actually not working and not serving communities of color for since its inception, and it's been designed to serve property owning white men, quite frankly, if we study it, and that we can do better. And so the Breathe Act actually is our solution to this. The Breathe Act was an idea that I came up with after, inside of my role at the Move for Black Lives on the policy table. And it was in response to the loss and the killings of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, George Floyd, and really kind of inserting itself inside of a conversation that was being had around, like, why don't we just, reform qualified immunity or ban no-knock warrants, and realizing that those things were not going to bring us to an age or a reality of safety for Black people, and knowing that I want to see a world in which my family can be safe and free. I wanted something more robust, and that really actually could be an answer to the call from the streets and from the 50 state, protests and uprisings that we've been seeing. And so the Breathe Act actually lays out exactly what we mean when we say defund. Defund is a blueprint for the safety of all communities, and particularly for safety for Black people. And so I would say, look at that, go to breatheact.org. You can sign up to be a community co-sponsor. You can find the bill summary there. We'll actually be, soon we'll be releasing the full omnibus outline to the public. And so that will be very exciting. And that is one thing that Essie and I have been working on to make it real.
I can't wait to see that. We are at time. As you can see, we can go on for hours talking about not just women, but things that are changing the lives and the justice system and how we can move to improve that. So thank you so much for almost ending on conversation, I think, with one of the best solutions, which is for folks to get active, for folks to start to work, as you said, you're a community builder, to start to get active in our communities, figure out where you can fit in, understand the conversation, read the data, read the reports, listen to what women are saying. I appreciate you for, bringing that to the forefront as we end this conversation. And typically, like, what I would like to do, I would like to end this up with, if there's any last thing you would like to say, Gina, to the folks that are listening to us about, one thing you would like to say to them before we wrap up, please say it now. And thank you so much.
Just thank you. Stay committed, stay hopeful. I really do believe that we can do this together if we keep asking the right questions and believing in one another.
Could not have said it better. I totally agree. Thank you everyone for attending our conversation. Gina, until next time.
Thanks, Aishatu. Thank you.
Bye.